Hi everybody, today I got out the Radeon X1950 XTX card to do a little retro testing with. The computer in the picture, or in the feed here, is a DFI NF4 N4 setup with an Athlon 64X2 at 2.5 gigahertz. There's an Audio 2 in the bottom, and then there's a video card, and it has 2 gig of RAM. We're going to take a look at how this card runs some old games, new games, or newish games, and a couple of 3DMarks as well, and take a look at what kind of features the card has, and also get a recording of what the fan sounds like. So let's start off with taking a look at the control panel. ATI Catalyst Control Center. This is Catalyst 7.11 because 7.11 seems to be a nice point to stop at for compatibility with older games, and that's because at 7.12 some things break, like Star Wars Republic Commando has bump mapping problems, for example, and I have these two games, Instinct and You Are Empty. Those are Ukrainian games, and they're on the same engine, and those don't render right on Catalyst 10.2 Legacy. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic has problems after Catalyst 7.11. If you use 7.11, all visual features will be available, like soft shadows and the light bloom. Whereas if you go to the next version, Catalyst 7.12, you'll lose both of those features, I believe. If you want to run a newer driver, you can keep the Catalyst 7.11 OpenGL driver by downloading 7.11 and extracting it, and then going into the driver directory and copying ATI OGLXX DLL. You need to expand it. This underscore at the end means it's compressed. You can use 7-zip to extract it. And then you have the DLL, which you can place in, say, the Kotor directory, and this will cause the game to use this OpenGL driver instead of the one that's currently installed. So you can have Catalyst 7.11 OpenGL with a later Catalyst release. So that's a handy thing, a handy option that you have. This is a Radeon X1950 Crossfire Edition, which means it has the connector for the Crossfire cable, and it has some compositing hardware on board to do the Crossfire stuff. You can run it separately though. It functions the same as a regular X1950 XTX, otherwise same clock speeds. Right now it's at 506, 594 because those are the desktop clock rates to run cooler, use less power. Other features in this that are interesting. Catalyst 7.11 does not have aspect ratio scaling. Nothing prior to this does either. At some point, a newer driver does get it. I know Catalyst 10.2 Legacy supports aspect ratio scaling. So that's a handy thing to have, and might be worth using Catalyst 10.2 for if you desire aspect ratio scaling, if your monitor is unfriendly regarding keeping aspect ratios right and stuff like that. Desktop color correction, HDTV stuff. 3D features. The X1950 or all the X1000 cards have Smooth Vision HD, which is multi-sample anti-aliasing. It's rotated grid sampling, and it's gamma corrected, which means it's superior to NVIDIA's prior to GeForce 8. Rotated grid, gamma corrected, it cleans up the edges more than what NVIDIA does prior to GeForce 8. So at 4x on here, it's more like NVIDIA's 8x, say, something like that. There's also, this thing can do 2 to 6x. 6x on here is pretty much the best anti-aliasing quality of the time. It also has something called temporal anti-aliasing, which what it does is it alternates the sampling pattern per frame. So you get an effective 6x while at 4x. And this means you get 6x speed for no cost. But the catch is your game needs to be running at 60 frames per second. Otherwise you will see at least 60 frames per second. Otherwise you will see the pattern changing, and that will ruin the whole effect. So your game has to be able to run at least 60 frames per second, which limits the usefulness of temporal AAA, but it's still an interesting option. And we can take a look at what the patterns look like with this handy dandy DX9 FSAA viewer. This is 2x anti-aliasing with temporal AA. You see there are 4 sampling points on there, and it's flickering because they're changing. So you can see how that works. This is what F2X FSAA normally looks like. You just have 2 sampling points. And 2x FSAA is somewhat useless in some ways because it only works in one direction. And in like one direction is anti-aliasing, but the other is not, like horizontal versus vertical. So half of the stair stepping is still there. So in a way, it's not really better than nothing. But it is kind of better than nothing. But it creates kind of a weird fuzzy edge instead of a jagged edge. Whereas with 4x is really the sweet spot because it covers both horizontal and vertical. And this is a 4x pattern without temporal anti-aliasing. Now if we enable temporal anti-aliasing on 4x, and it actually works right, this program is a little, I'm having some problems with it not showing patterns. But essentially 4x will look like 6x. But it is not cooperating with me. I've been trying to get it to record this for like, okay, there it is. You see it? You have the flickering effect of temporal AA, and there are 6 sampling points. So you have this 4x mode, but it's effectively 6x, which is really high quality, and the speed will be the same as 4x. And then if you want regular 6x, there's a regular 6x pattern. Anyway, moving on here to adaptive anti-aliasing. Adaptive anti-aliasing is a technique to anti-alias transparent textures. This fence is not made out of individual polygon geometry. It's a transparent texture. So in order to anti-alias jagged edges in there as a result of it being resized or whatever, they do something called super sampling on that. Although you can also use multi-sampling, but multi-sampling is less effective. But it's faster, so you know, usual compromise there. So you have that, and this is something that got backported to the X800 cards at the time too. And that's also true for the temporal AA that is available on X800 series as well. Now, for anisotropic filtering, the X1000 cards have the highest quality anisotropic filtering prior to GeForce 8. It's much higher quality than what you can get out of a GeForce 7 or 6 or older. And it supports the usual 2 to 16x. There is also a setting called high quality AF. What that does is it reduces or it increases the coverage of the anisotropic filtering. Normally, anisotropic filtering is not applied on some angles. It's called angle dependency. And sometimes you can see that in a game if you're in a scene that has lots of not 90-degree angles to things, if everything's not perpendicular to whatever, you might see a texture on there that is blurry up in the distance because the anisotropic filtering is not filtering it. High quality AF will cover more angles more completely to avoid that problem. And we can see this too. I have another program here which will show you this is the AF pattern texture filtering pattern on this card. This is trilinear filtering right now, I think, or just bilinear maybe. On 1x, that means there's no anisotropic filtering. And then you go 2x, and you'll start to see a pattern forming. It's like a star. And what you're seeing is there's anisotropic filtering, and then there's no anisotropic filtering. It's showing you the angles that it is effective at and isn't effective at. Let's crank this to 16, and it's a very obvious star flower pattern now. But if you go on to here and you turn on high quality AF, you get, see, it's not really a jagged flower star thing anymore. It's much more rounded. And what that means is it's covering more angles of anisotropic filtering. There aren't any gaps in what's being filtered. And this pattern is more like what you see on a GeForce 8800, really. This is a very high quality anisotropic filtering. Next, Catalyst AI is ATI's. This allows you to configure whether ATI's application optimizations are enabled. And for the most part, you don't want to turn that off because they're not detrimental to the quality of the game, and they do give you more performance. Maybe they worked around something the developer did that was inefficient, whatever. And this will apply things like that to different games. You can put it on advanced mode, which supposedly is more aggressive, but I don't know if that's ever been thoroughly tested, and it's probably not really worth messing with, honestly. And you don't want to disable this typically because you're just going to make a game run slower typically, and it won't look better. So, I mean, maybe there is some game out there with some kind of quirk because of ATI's optimizations, but I don't know of anything offhand. So really, just kind of leave this alone. Mipmap detail level. This affects a level of detail, the LOD of the mipmaps going into the distance. So on high quality, you're going to have sharper textures in the distance, whereas if you turn this down, it'll bring in lower resolution ones sooner. And that is faster, but it can also be beneficial to you because sometimes you'll have textures in the distance that are too sharp. There's too much detail on them, and that can cause moire patterns, and it'll look like a swimming alias noise mess in the distance. Like on a brick wall, that can really do it. And in that case, you might want to come in here and drop this down to performance or quality if you want to make the scene look a little cleaner and softer. I think I understand that NVIDIA typically runs a lower setting here, which is somewhat, might be sort of controversial, but in some games, like I've seen Half-Life 2 Episode 1, for example, that can have a lot of noisy texture aliasing on ATI cards, even on like a 4870, and you can come in here and do this, and it'll make the game look essentially look nicer. But usually you want to leave it on high quality because it is higher quality. and it'll give you a sharper picture. And usually it works fine. So whatever. Direct 3D settings, you have control over DirectX texture compression. If you want to, for some reason, change what the game sees your card supports, you probably don't want to mess with that. Alternative pixel center. This is something for old games that have problems with text rendering because of some old standard of the time, maybe Voodoo related, like way back. We're talking like 1998 games or something. Like X-Wing Alliance sometimes had problems with font corruption where you couldn't read the HUD. This is what you would mess with for that. OpenGL settings, triple buffering on OpenGL is a nice feature. If you use vsync and you play a game and say you have a 60 hertz monitor and your game can't maintain 60 frames per second, what'll happen is if vsync is enabled, it'll drop down to 30 frames per second. It drops down to these multiples or whatever fractions of the refresh rate. If you use triple buffering, it changes how the game's the frame buffer is behaving, and it will eliminate that behavior with dropping down to the fractions of the refresh rate. So you can still have, say, 45 frames per second or 50 frames per second with vsync enabled. So that's nice. Direct 3D works differently. The application controls whether it does triple buffering or not. So ATI didn't have that, and NVIDIA doesn't have that in the control panel either. Both companies have triple buffering for OpenGL, but if you want to force direct 3D triple buffering, you need to find some homebrew utilities like D3D Overrider, for example, which I have on here because it's very handy to have for some games like Stalker. It can force VSync and triple buffering for you. Quite nice. And then and here there's also forced 24-bit Z buffer depth. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that. Usually you want the application to choose whatever it wants. But there must be something that can benefit from being forced to use a 24-bit Z buffer. Then we have more stuff in here. Color correction for the desktop. Video quality stuff like deinterlacing settings. VPU recover. VPU recover is a function that prevents the display driver from taking down the OS if it crashes. So if you have some kind of weird stability problems with the card or your motherboard or the driver or whatever, this will just restart the driver and you can keep on working instead of blowing up Windows and rebooting with a blue screen or something like that. That's kind of nice. But if you're kidding, if this thing's doing its stuff frequently, there's something wrong with your computer. And overdrive is just ATI's official overclocking utility if you want to mess with that. But I'm going to keep everything at defaults for the testing here. And now we're going to check out 3DMark 2001 and 05 along with a smattering of games and see how well the card runs them, and eventually switch to Windows 7 for some newer games. Quake 3 runs very nicely on here with these drivers. I have it set up with a custom 1080p resolution.
Phobos.
It runs completely smooth, 60 frames per second, and I don't think there's any visual anomalies present in this.
For the lead.
Undying is an old Unreal-based horror shooter, and it runs well on here too. The X1000 series is the last series of cards with 16-bit color dithering support, and it also has it's a really interesting appearance to the dithering. It's different than the previous X800 and 9700 era cards with 16-bit color. It's not easy to see here. I'm not sure it's actually on 16-bit right now. Yeah, it is. So it's running 16-bit color right now. It's only 1024 by 768. But this card does run a lot of old games well.
Jammed.
It also works pretty well with glide emulators, such as DG Voodoo. I like because DG Voodoo 1 supports 16-bit rendering. So this is Wheel of Time. This is another Unreal Engine game, and I have it set up on 16-bit color. It's only 800 by 600 right now, so you can really see the dithering. On things. Hopefully. I'm sure YouTube will blur it all out, unfortunately. But it's a very nice appearance. And it runs very well through DG Voodoo here. You wouldn't want to try to run the old Direct 3D renderer this game has through anything modern, or anything old really, because it was Unreal Tournament engine and it had a very poor Direct 3D implementation back then that only worked somewhat well on cards of the time, and it was missing some of the features. Like right now you have the detail texturing where a texture fades in when you get close. That doesn't work very well with Direct 3D. So using a glide wrapper with old Unreal Engine games is preferable. Unreal Tournament, I have that set up with Chris Donnell's UTGLR, and it runs that extremely well. Though UT tends to run at the wrong speed on modern CPUs. And yeah, it's running way too fast right now. But it looks nice. And you have S3TC textures here for UTGLR, which is nice. It's just a matter of getting it to run at the right speed on whatever computer you're playing it on. It's too bad that Epic never patched this problem. This is an Athlon 64X2 at 2.5 gigahertz here. It has the dual core optimizer to fix the timestamp issue, but that doesn't help Kotor, it doesn't help UT, unfortunately. Let's try Kotor out. So with Kotor, in this driver, you can enable the frame buffer effects and soft shadowing. So everything's enabled. And you can see along near light sources, there's kind of a bloomy, hazy thing going on, which is letting bloom. There are no shadows in here. but there now you have soft shadows. Soft shadows and the bloom, which is pretty nice for an ATI card running Kotor. Though I wouldn't be surprised if the performance is less than ideal. This game really is designed for NVIDIA cards. But it does work well on the X1000 series.
Through our streets. We cannot see about this box
Overall.
affects our society.
And No One Lives Forever, that runs well too, which is kind of surprising to me because Lith Tech can be problematic. Lith Tech Talon, I think. And Stalker Shadow of Chernobyl runs great on it as well. This is running at it's set up for maximum quality 1920 by 1080, full dynamic lighting. And it's essentially it's quite playable at this setting. It's not super fast, but I mean an 8800, a GeForce 8800 is much faster, but it's definitely running it fairly well. And I would probably play it like this because it looks great. I played the game quite a bit on this card and the 8800. I didn't see any problems with either cards. You always want to make sure with Stalker that you set it up with the no prefetch tweak. Otherwise it'll probably crash eventually and it'll also stutter a lot more than usual. That's something you add to the command line. And this has the Zone Reclamation project installed, which is like a third-party bug fix patch that people have put together. It fixes a lot of issues with the game and adds free play when you beat it. But it's basically a stock experience, which is nice. This game has a quirk though where if you want vsync enabled, you have to do it yourself in the control panel or with D3D Overrider. I usually run with D3D Overrider because D3D Overrider adds triple buffering, which prevents the frame rate loss with vsync. So that's something that you should probably take a look at if you're going to play some Stalker. Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. This is a Source Engine game. It's one of the first Source Engine licensees. It runs pretty well on here. Running 1080p. Recommended settings, mostly high quality. It's a bit stuttery. I think this game is fairly CPU limited though, and I think the Athlon 64X2 in here isn't really fast enough to keep it completely smooth. But it runs pretty well. Ironically, I think Dishonored runs better than this, which is their next game. Arcane's next game. That is Unreal Engine 3. I'll load that up eventually here, too. Show you that.
She had woken me up. She had come and gone, and now
Max
I was
Payne.
being shot at. I had to catch her, find out what was going on.
Max Payne 2 runs perfectly as well, which maybe isn't surprising. Max Payne 2 is pretty resilient across different cards.
Oh, no, you won't. Get out! Get out! No one's driving me out of my home.
Careful with that gun, lady.
I've called the police. They're coming to take you away. I didn't want to shoot. He gave me no choice. This is my home. I have a right to defend it.
Then we have f.e.a.r. f.e.a.r. runs pretty well at 1080p on here. I have it set up. I let auto detect run, but I turn the resolution up. You can also enable soft shadows. Here, so this game's soft shadows are a little strange though. Definitely have a major performance hit. So I'd probably leave those off on this generation of cards. And I'm not really sure that they add all that much anyway, because how they don't look that good. But yeah, this is a very demanding game. It doesn't run extremely well at 1080p on here. An interesting thing I've noticed with this card is the light shining through the windows here has a blocky look at some angles or distances, I suppose. Hopefully it'll show up on the video. You can see the edges of it are pixelated. It's actually worse on the newer drivers than this. 10.2 makes these look even more pixelated. That's the only weird quirk I've noticed with this card on this game. It runs very well for the most part. Well, I guess it's very demanding for it, but there are no problems. And it's certainly a lot faster than an X800 was.
Hold on a sec. Come on.
You ready?
Okay, now I'm going to run 3DMark 05 on here. And we're going to see what this looks like, what score it gets, this default settings on 3DMark. And I'm going to turn on the sound so you can hear the fan of the card better, hopefully, and hear it change speeds during this. I don't think it'll spin up the full speed during this because it's only going to be at 1024 by 768, but still be able to hear, get an idea of what this card sounds like. Okay, now I'll run it through 3DMark 2001. Okay, I switched to Windows 7 and I'm going to try some newer games. This is Fallout 3. It runs fairly well at 1920 by 1080 with 8x AF on here. Here, let me show you gameplay. This is Catalyst 10.2 now. 10.2 Legacy. As you can see, 1080p Fallout 3 is quite playable. Anti-aliasing is a bit too much for it, but other than that, it runs quite well with no anti-aliasing. I have Dead Space 2, which is running at 1080p, and it's mostly playable, a little bit slow. This is Dishonored, which is a Unreal Engine 3 game running. It's running 1280 by 720. f.e.a.r is enabled, shadows, light shafts, eye detail. It runs pretty well. This game is newer than the latest drivers you can get for this card, so it's somewhat surprising that it works properly at all. I suppose it's fortuitous that it uses Unreal Engine 3 because Unreal Engine 3 was released far enough back that the drivers have support for it to some degree, even though this game is newer than the drivers.
I don't think that the boils are at all good looking.
Bill, this game is more something you'd want to play on like a HD 4850 or a GeForce 560, something like that. But it runs all right.
I regret my connections haven't been more use to you. When this business is over, though, then you'll see what I'm worth.
Alright, so we've checked out a bunch of games and 3DMark and old games and new games and different quality stuff, anti-aliasing and isotropic filtering, and we've seen that it runs stuff pretty well. It has an interesting 16-bit dithering pattern. It works with glide wrappers. And so do we want an X1950 for old games or whatever we're doing? I think the X1000 series is pretty nice, actually. I think it's more appealing than the X800 cards usually. Although the X800 cards, you can get a true form emulation. It's pretty demanding, but you can do that. You can't do that with the X1000 cards. However, the X1000 cards I think they have a superior dithering pattern for the 16-bit color, which is pretty cool. And it certainly is much faster than an X850 for newer games. So you have more flexibility there. So I don't know, I think it's a highly useful card. I think I prefer it over, say, a HD 2900 for sure. Those cards are kind of glitchy and very noisy. 3850, 3870 era stuff is pretty similar but cooler than a 2900. But you can still run with the 2900 and a 3850. You can still run Catalyst 7.11, so that's nice. But those cards completely lack 16-bit dithering, and that's a massive problem for old games. So if you're going to play anything old that you want to run 16-bit color on, and you definitely do not want a DirectX 10 card or DirectX 11 card for that matter. So yeah, I think the X1000 series definitely has its place for various old games, and it works well on any PCI Express slot basically. I've used it on PCIe 2.0 and 3.0 without problems. And you can run Windows 10 with it, I believe. Although the drivers are iffy. The ATI didn't release official drivers beyond basically Windows 7. So, I mean, you can work the drivers into Windows 8 and Windows 10, but it's not really supported, so it's tricky. So that is kind of an issue, I suppose. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed all this stuff. It was an interesting effort for me. And thank you for watching.